Aesthetics. In the previous videos in this series, we discussed both Schopenhauer's metaphysics and his ethics. The first video deals with the question, what is there? And the second video asks, what should we do about it? If you haven't done so already, I highly recommend you watch these two videos before watching this one, especially the first one dealing with metaphysics. That might sound strange, because the general question of aesthetics is, what is beauty? Yet, as we'll see, a solid understanding of Schopenhauer's metaphysical theory is necessary in order to understand what Schopenhauer means when he says, beautiful. Going forward, this video will assume at least a basic grasp of Schopenhauer's theory of the will. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's dive in. Part 1. The need for art. As always, when discussing Schopenhauer, we need to keep in mind one thing at all times. Life is suffering, and the world is a hell. For whence did Dante take the materials for his hell, but from this, our actual world? And yet he made a very proper hell of it. And when, on the other hand, he came to the task of describing heaven and its delights, he had an insurmountable difficulty before him, for our world affords no materials at all for this. Why is this important? Because this is where art comes in. Schopenhauer's theory of aesthetics is actually very simple. Art allows us to forget the suffering of the world. In the aesthetic contemplation, which is another way of saying when enjoying a good piece of art, we temporarily forget ourselves. For a brief moment, the artwork takes us out of this world, out of this hell, for a brief moment in which we enjoy simple beauty without being reminded of the suffering that plagues ourselves and the world around us. Aesthetic pleasure in the beautiful consists in great measure in the fact that in entering the state of pure contemplation, we are lifted for the moment above all willing, i.e. all wishes and cares. We become, as it were, freed from ourselves. This is the case because, as humans, we are creatures of both will and reason. What happens when we lose ourselves and a good piece of art is we temporarily forget that we are willing creatures. And, as we saw in previous videos, the will, the desire, is the cause of all suffering. We forget about the will because what happens when we enjoy art is that our reason takes over. Our reason takes delight in enjoying art because art is the domain of reason, being that art is the earthly representation of a Platonic idea. Schopenhauer uses the term Platonic idea to drive home the point that artwork tries to recreate, necessarily imperfectly, an ideal form of a thing. When, for example, an artist paints a hand, he tries to paint the perfect hand. The perfect hand, of course, does not exist in the material world. It only exists in an abstract manner as an idea. Yet, the more the artist approaches that ideal, the more beautiful his artwork becomes. After all the talk of Kant's metaphysical system, after all the talk of objects and subjects and things in themselves and will, it might strike you as strange for Schopenhauer to suddenly introduce Platonic ideas to the mix. But Platonic ideas, for Schopenhauer, constitute an important part of his metaphysics. The Platonic idea is will not yet become representation. The Platonic idea is an intermediate step. It hovers, so to speak, between pure will and between representation. The Platonic idea is the primeval form. The Platonic idea is necessarily object, something known, a representation, and in that respect is different from the thing in itself, i.e. the will, but in that respect only. It has merely laid aside the subordinate forms of the phenomenon, or rather, it has not yet assumed them, but it has retained the first and most universal form, that of the representation in general, the form of being object for a subject. In a good artwork, therefore, our reason is delighted in contemplating the Platonic idea, the world of abstractions. In other words, a world that is far removed from the world of our day-to-day lives, the world of reason as opposed to the world of representation. We enjoy escaping, even for just a moment, this evil world of representation, with all its suffering and multiplicity, and we delight in contemplating the Platonic form of things. It gives us repose. It allows us, quite literally, to lose ourselves. Behind all the verbose language and arguments and descriptions, however, we must never forget what is actually being said. What Schopenhauer has just explained in logical, intelligible language is nothing more and nothing less than the completely ordinary experience we all have of enjoying art. It is Schopenhauer's attempt at explaining that feeling you get when you're at a museum and a painting grabs your attention. You stare at it and you feel like you get lost in it. Part 2. The Sublime. There is, however, another kind of aesthetic experience. This kind is not concerned with man-made art, but with the beauty and splendor of nature. The aesthetic contemplation of nature can go beyond simple artistic pleasure. In an experience of the sublime, of the overwhelming force, of beauty and constancy of nature, Schopenhauer says we can learn more about ourselves. Have you ever been completely in awe of a mountain view, a sunset, or even a lightning storm? If so, you might have experienced the sublime. In witnessing the majesty of nature, you feel small, insignificant. But, more importantly, according to Schopenhauer, it's a reminder of your own mortality as opposed to undying nature. You might perish, but nature will not. The mountains will always be there, towering above. This is a very powerful feeling, and you can get lost in it. The person who is so enraptured by nature forgets himself, temporarily forgets he even inhabits a body, temporarily forgets his own individuality. It is a moment of enlightenment, not unlike that of the ascetic. This person suddenly and violently realizes that he is the world, and that the world is him. Whoever now has become so absorbed and lost in the perception of nature becomes in this way directly conscious that, as such, he is the condition, that is, the supporter of the world and all objective existence. For this now shows itself as dependent upon his existence. Thus he draws nature into himself, so that he sees it to be merely an accident of his own being. In this sense, Byron says, "Are not the mountains, waves and skies a part of me and of my soul, as I of them?" The sublime contemplation is another way of arriving at Schopenhauer's fundamental truth, that there is no difference between yourself and the world, but that all is one. Part 3. Music. For Schopenhauer, music is the most perfect art form. In fact, it stands lonely at the top, leaving the rest of the arts, such as literature, painting, and sculpture, far behind. Where does this primacy of music come from? For the purpose of illustration, we'll compare music to painting, but of course the larger point is equally valid for the other arts such as literature and sculpture. What does the painter try to do? As we have discussed in the first part of this video, it's the painter's job to recreate the Platonic idea as faithfully as possible. What does this mean? It means the painter takes a look at the world, let's say he sees a beautiful sunset, and then he tries to translate his impression of the sunset onto the canvas. In other words, the painter looks at reality and tries to make a faithful adaptation of it. Music is different. Music is not concerned with Platonic ideas. To grasp this, just try to imagine what music looks like. Of music, Schopenhauer says, "It stands alone, quite cut off from all the other arts. In it, we do not recognize the copy or repetition of any idea of existence in the world. Yet it is such a great and exceedingly noble art, its effect on the inmost nature of man so powerful, and it is so entirely and deeply understood by him in his inmost consciousness as a perfectly universal language, the distinctness of which surpasses even that of the perceptible world itself." Music allows us to participate in the world as will, similarly to the sublime experience. Music allows us to briefly lose ourselves completely. This is because music, uniquely among the arts, is not a copy of a Platonic idea, not a copy of a representation, but a copy of will itself. Music is by no means like the other arts, the copy of the ideas, but the copy of the will itself, whose objectivity the ideas are. This is why the effect of music is so much more powerful and penetrating than that of the other arts, for they speak only of the shadows, but music speaks of the thing itself. Long before movies were a thing, Schopenhauer offers us here an explanation for the great power of the soundtrack. This deep relation which music has to the true nature of all things also explains the fact that suitable music, played to any scene, action, event, or surrounding, seems to disclose to us its most secret meaning, and appears as the most accurate and distinct commentary upon it. We might, therefore, just as well call the world embodied music as embodied will, and this is the reason why music makes every picture, and indeed every scene of real life and of the world, at once appear with higher significance. We perceive music only through time, not through both space and time. Therefore, it is one step further removed from the ordinary material world of the representation. This is Schopenhauer's metaphysical explanation for why we love music so much. In a way, music is not a part of this world, and since this world is a hell, music brings us closer to heaven. Conclusion. Art and the beauty of nature offer us a temporary escape from the sufferings of the world. We enjoy art precisely for this reason. The better the artwork, the more we get lost in it, the more we forget our surroundings. The same is true of nature. A mountain view makes us feel small. It makes us forget our individuality, and we can feel part of something bigger than ourselves. Part of nature, part of the world, part of the universe. Beautiful music, likewise, allows us to rise above our earthly existence and for a brief moment enjoy a higher state of being.